I wasn't supposed to find this. The county archives basement wasn't on the building's floor plan.
The stairwell was hidden behind a warped supply shelf, its wood swollen from decades of damp. The air down there clung to me like something alive, humid, rancid, and tasting faintly of metal. My flashlight's beam caught floating dust motes that moved as if they had their own slow pulse. The steps ended in a corridor lined with rusted filing cabinets, their labels yellowed and curling. My boots stuck slightly to the floor, where some slick residue had long ago congealed. I was searching for property tax maps from the 1890s, part of a dry historical commission project, but what I found made me forget the entire assignment. Tucked between two cabinets was a ledger.
Thick, leather-bound, its cover was mottled with mold blooms that looked disturbingly like bruises. No index. No title. Only a date burned into the leather, 1894. The pages were stiff but intact. The handwriting inside was precise, almost surgical, with looping black ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. Most entries were mundane shipments of grain, coal deliveries, names I didn't recognize until one column caught my eye. In neat block letters, beside several names, was a single recurring word, adopted. It wasn't the word itself that chilled me, but the way it was paired with numbers, 3 digits, always beginning with 237. In some entries, the numbers were smudged, overwritten. On others, the ink had been so heavily blotted it tore the paper. Halfway through the book, I turned a page and found an entry where the name had been scratched out entirely, the grooves deep enough to cut into the next leaf. Only the number remained, 237 to 114. And beneath it, in cramped handwriting, a note in Latin, Fiat corpus una anima, let the body be one soul. The ink on that line was fresher than the rest. It couldn't have been more than a few years old. Something shifted in the darkness. The silence down here wasn't empty, it was listening. I froze, aware of the weight of the building above me, the layers of history pressing down. My pulse began to sync with the dripping somewhere deeper in the corridor. I snapped the ledger shut and looked over my shoulder. The cabinets loomed like grave markers. My beam caught a black smear along the wall, not paint, not ink. It had bled into the stone itself, forming the faint shape of the same number, 237. I should have walked away. Left the ledger there, closed the shelf, and forgotten the hidden stairwell. But the name on the next unblotted page made that impossible. It was my grandmother's. And beside her name, the word, adopted. I don't know why, but I felt suddenly as if someone else was holding the flashlight, my wrist tense, my grip not entirely my own. I knew then that the ledger hadn't been hidden from me by chance. It was meant to be found. By me. When I left the archive, the book was under my coat. My hands shook the entire walk home. The street lamps buzzed, flickering in sync with my thoughts. I told myself I'd look at it only once more, just to confirm what I'd seen. But deep down, I already knew whatever 237 meant, it was carved into my family, and into me. I started with the number. A week after finding the ledger, I was buried in digitized county census records, cross-referencing names with whatever scraps of information the Historical Society had bothered to scan. 237 appeared again and again, not as a street address or parcel number, but as a column in handwritten intake forms from an institution I'd never heard of, the St. Adriel Home for the Unclaimed. Officially, St. Adriel's was established in 1889 on a tract of land north of town, a converted seminary backed by both the diocese and the County Poor Commission. The paper trail painted it as a mercy, a sanctuary for abandoned children, the morally wayward, and those needing moral correction. The language was Victorian in its piety, heavy with words like charity, discipline, and God's covenant. The photos in the newspaper archives were all the same. Rows of children pale, unsmiling, posed before the institution's brick facade. Tall, narrow windows like unblinking eyes. In every image, the children's clothing looked slightly too big, as though they were wearing someone else's garments. The captions always named the same man, Reverend Dr. Elias Carrick, founder and superintendent. Carrick's face was handsome in a way that felt calculated, strong jaw, high brow, steel gray eyes that stared directly into the camera. According to the diocesan records, he had trained in both theology and medicine in Philadelphia before returning home to heal both body and soul.
In the church bulletins, his sermons were printed alongside lines from the Psalms about obedience and purity.
But the ledger told a different story. The intake forms for St. Adriel's had a column labeled status.
Most entries were mundane: in residence, reassigned, transferred, but for dozens of names, the notation was the same as in my ledger: adopted, 237. There were no corresponding discharge papers, no records of where these adopted children went. And then there was the other column, one I'd almost missed because it had been blacked out on every microfilm copy. The original, stored on brittle paper in the county vault, had survived the censor's pen. The header read, Corpus Unum, one body. Next to each adopted name, the same Latin phrase appeared that I'd found in the ledger: Fiat corpus una anima. The more I dug, the less the institution resembled an orphanage and the more it looked like a sealed ecosystem, one from which no one ever emerged.
Death certificates were curiously absent.
Alumni lists were non-existent.
And yet, the state budget reports for the 1920s and 30s showed steady funding increases, as though St. Adriel's population was somehow growing. I found one living witness.
Martha Greeley was 94 and nearly blind, living in a nursing home 2 towns over. When I mentioned St. Adriel's, she flinched. "They told us it was a school," she said in a whisper that forced me to lean close.
"Told us we'd be useful. That Father Carrick would make us pure."
Her hands trembled as she gripped the bed rail. "But no one left, dear."
"No one.
Not even when they said we'd been adopted. We just went upstairs."
I asked her what was upstairs.
She shook her head violently.
"Not upstairs. Up.
The place where the walls got narrow and the air smelled sweet."
He called it the Hollow Doctrine. Said it was the only way to make us one.
Her nurse came in then, and the conversation ended. But her words stuck to me like damp wool.
The official record said St. Adriel's was demolished in 1954.
But the satellite map showed a rectangle of untouched forest where the building once stood, the tree canopy strangely uniform as though something was still standing under it.
I thought the real horror was the building. I was wrong.
It was the way St. Adriel's erased people until nothing remained but the shape of a body that could belong to anyone. 2 weeks after visiting Martha Greeley, I gained access to the diocesan basement in St. Michael's Parish. A friendly archivist named Thomas, more curious than cautious, handed me a box labeled St. Adriel, Miscellaneous.
Inside, I found what should have been letters from children to their families. The handwriting was neat but strangely uniform, as if they'd all been trained to form their letters the exact same way. The sentences blurred together: "I am learning to be pure. Reverend Carrick says I am nearly ready. Soon we will be one."
The signatures were worse. At first, they were distinct: Anna L., Samuel R., Margaret Holt. But as the years progressed, they narrowed to initials. By 1932, there were no names at all, only a looping symbol, 2 circles intersecting, drawn in heavy ink.
And then I found the portraits. Cabinet cards from the 1900s, stiffly posed against the same mottled backdrop.
Different children, but always the same expression: wide eyes, mouth pressed flat, head tilted slightly as if listening to an unheard command. Their hair was parted identically. Even the folds in their collars seemed deliberate, mirrored from photo to photo. On the back of each was a penciled name, then, in every case, a hard slash through it. It wasn't just the children who were rewritten. Among the files was a small journal belonging to Sister Evangeline, one of the nuns who worked under Carrick. Her early entries were mundane, full of patient lists and weather notes.
But midway through, her sentences began to drift. "Carrick says my name is too heavy. He will give me a better one. Soon I will be light enough to pass through." The last entry was dated September 12, 1928. "Today I forgot my mother's face." It was a mercy. The air in the basement had gone stale. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, irrationally afraid I'd see someone standing there, watching me read. The archivist had gone upstairs to fetch tea, but I swear I could hear slow breathing just behind the far shelf. Back home, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. The repetition in the children's letters was exact, down to the placement of smudges, as though they'd been copied from a master template. The more I read them,
the harder it became to keep track of which letter belonged to whom.
Eventually, I realized I'd stopped reading the names entirely.
I returned to Martha for answers, but her nurse told me she'd had a turn the day after our first conversation. Her speech was muddled now, her gaze vacant.
She didn't remember St. Adriel's. She didn't remember me.
The nurse said she'd been calling herself Seven. One last piece came to me in the form of a local stonecutter's ledger. In 1935, the diocese commissioned a series of marble plaques for St. Adriel's. Each bore dozens of names until someone chiseled through them, turning letters into deep, jagged scars. They still paid for the work.
No births. No deaths. No records.
Just the steady disappearance of identity, until nothing could be traced, no one could be claimed.
I used to think names were permanent, etched into history.
Now I knew they could be pulled out like stitches, and the wound would close without anyone noticing.
The forest where St. Adriel's once stood was too quiet.
No bird calls, no insect hum, just the constant low hiss of wind through the pines, though the branches barely moved.
My GPS kept recalculating, as if the location itself refused to settle.
The building's remains didn't appear until I was almost on top of them, the rear facade of red brick, still mostly intact, jutting from the earth like the stern of a half-buried ship. The front must have collapsed long ago, swallowed by the soil. Vines covered the windows, their tendrils thick as wrists. The main door was blocked by a slab of poured concrete, but a collapsed section on the east wall revealed a sloping corridor leading down instead of in. The air that rolled out was damp and sweet, the scent of lilies rotting in water. Inside, the hallway slanted at odd angles, as though the floors had been poured without gravity in mind. Doorways were too narrow for comfort, forcing my shoulders to graze the frames. The plaster walls were bloated from water damage, but in some places the bubbling was deliberate, almost sculpted, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like human profiles. I followed a stairwell that should have led to a basement, but halfway down the steps looped and began rising again, depositing me back at the same landing I'd started from. Only on the third attempt did I notice a small door behind the first flight, low enough that I had to crawl through. It opened into a chamber lined with dozens of shallow alcoves, each holding a narrow cot. Iron rings were bolted into the walls above them. On the floor lay glass vials labeled in Latin, laudanum, tinctura opii, oleum papaverus. The stale air shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt, though it was cold enough to sting my skin.
On one cot lay a leather satchel, inside of which was a stack of black and white photographs.
They showed children lying in identical positions, eyes closed, hands folded over their chests, while adults in white robes placed mirrored discs over their faces. In every photograph, Reverend Carrick stood behind them, his hand raised as though in blessing. A drip echoed somewhere beyond the chamber, drawing me toward a rusted elevator shaft. Its doors hung open, revealing a darkness so complete it felt solid. I leaned in, shining my light down. There was no bottom, only an endless drop, the beam swallowed before it could touch anything. And then I heard it faint, like breath against my ear, my name.
Once, then again. I jerked back so hard my spine hit the alcove wall.
The whisper didn't come from the shaft anymore, it came from behind me. The vials I'd seen were now upright, aligned in a perfect row in the center of the floor.
I hadn't touched them.
The candle stub on a nearby shelf flared to life, its flame steady despite the draft that whistled through the door. The plaster wall behind the candle darkened, as though wet.
A trickle ran down, red against the pale surface. My first thought was rust. My second was that rust doesn't pulse.
I left then, crawling back through the low door, but the hallway beyond was wrong. The angles had shifted. Doors I'd passed before were gone, replaced by blank walls, while others appeared where there had been none.
My phone's compass spun uselessly. When I finally reached the collapsed section and the forest air hit my face, I realized I'd been holding my breath.
My clothes smelled faintly of lilies. My pockets were empty except for a glass vial of laudanum I had no memory of taking. The vial of laudanum sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I could bring myself to touch it again. Its cork was intact, the liquid inside cloudy with age. Etched faintly into the glass, almost invisible unless caught in the right light, was the intersecting circle symbol I'd seen on the children's letters.
It wasn't unique to St. Adriel's.
While searching the state archives for property maps, I stumbled across a thick leather-bound registry mislabeled as Agricultural Holdings, 1902. The first dozen pages were about farmland leases, but beneath them, the entries shifted. Names of institutions, scattered across the state, each with their own intake numbers, 237, 451, 318. Every page bore the same intersecting circle symbol in the corner, hand-inked. The list was longer than I wanted to believe, not just orphanages, but rehabilitation homes, moral instruction academies, and sanitariums for the spiritually afflicted. The earliest dated back to 1871. The latest entry was from 1978. At first, I thought these were independent. But then I found the transfer records. Lines of neat script showed children moving between facilities hundreds of miles apart, sometimes in the same week. Beside their names, a notation, "Right complete or awaiting communion." Several transfers ended at a site I couldn't find on any public record, its name written simply as Corpus House. Buried among the papers was a folded, brittle map. Faint red ink connected each institution to the next, forming a web across the Midwest and Northeast. At the center, circled 3 times, was St. Adriel's. But what froze me wasn't the geography. It was a name. My grandmother's. The same notation, adopted, 237. But hers wasn't the only family connection. On a page dated 1949, there was another name I recognized immediately, my father's, at age 6. His entry ended not with adopted, but with transferred to Corpus House, right incomplete. I dug until I found a clue to who ran all this. It came in the form of a thin ledger titled The Order of the Fifth Veil. It was less a list of members than a manifesto, each page dense with instructions on unification of the flesh, erasure of the profane self, and the breaking of the sacred tongue. The Fifth Veil claimed to guard the passage and preserve the Hollow Doctrine across generations. The ledger was signed, in multiple hands, over nearly a century. The earliest name was Reverend Elias Carrick. The most recent, dated 1993, was a state senator whose face I'd seen on campaign billboards as a child. I don't know how I missed the sound at first, a faint, wet tapping from inside my apartment walls. When I pressed my ear to the plaster, I could almost make out a rhythm. 4 taps. Pause. 4 taps again. The same pattern repeated, like the strokes of a chisel cutting into stone. On impulse, I lifted the laudanum vial. The etched symbol on its surface now seemed deeper, as though freshly cut. I remembered the scratched-out names on the marble plaques, the uniform portraits, the erased letters. St. Adriel's had been only one mouth and a larger body, a body that had never died, only shifted, absorbed, spread. The web on that map wasn't history. It was anatomy. And I was standing inside one of its veins. I didn't expect to find anyone still alive in the ruins of St. Adriel's. The forest was darker this time, the air heavy and wet, as though rain had fallen only inside its borders. I followed the slope of the earth to the rear facade and crawled through the breach in the east wall. The corridors had shifted again, they always did, but this time I could hear something besides my own breath, a thin, wavering hum, like someone singing without words. I followed it to a narrow chamber lined with rusting hospital beds. On the last cot sat a boy, maybe 12, his hair neatly parted, his eyes fixed on a point just past me. A strip of linen bound his wrists to the bed frame, but loosely, as if no one believed he would try to leave. "They said you would come," he said softly. "Who?" My voice sounded too loud in the room. "The ones behind the veil. The ones who make us one." He blinked slowly, his gaze never quite meeting mine. "They're almost ready. Just one more." I stepped closer. On the floor beside him was a polished silver disc, the same mirrored circle from the photographs, large enough to cover his face. In its reflection, my features blurred, my skin paling until I almost looked like the portraits in the archive. "I can get you out," I told him. He tilted his head. "Will it matter if I get out?" The question stopped me cold. It wasn't defeat in his tone, it was certainty. Behind him, the wall was covered with photographs pinned in perfect rows, hundreds of faces, all staring forward, all identical in their expression. My grandmother's was there. My father's. A few of the newer ones were in color. One looked like it had been taken last month. That's when I saw the reel-to-reel recorder on the table, still spinning. I pressed the playback switch. A voice at Carrick's, unmistakable, filled the room, steady despite the decades.
Flesh is an instrument. One body is the hymn.
When the many are made one, there will be no suffering, no grief, no sin.
Only the voice. The tape clicked off. The boy watched me, his eyes now locked on mine. If you tell, they will bury the rest of us.
In walls, in paper, in the dirt.
We'll still be here. Just not where anyone can find us.
The weight of it pressed against my ribs, the files, the maps, the names. Exposing it all meant dragging every name into the open, but it also meant making every survivor a target for whoever still wore the fifth veil. Protecting them meant letting the Hollow Doctrine stay buried, until it surfaced again.
I don't remember deciding. My hands moved before my mind caught up.
I pulled the satchel of documents from my coat, dropped them into a rusted waste bin, and struck a match.
The flame took quickly, edges curling, ink turning to smoke. The boy didn't flinch. "Thank you," he whispered.
As the firelight flickered across the mirrored disc, I saw my own reflection fade, not vanish, just soften, as though it could be reshaped. I set the disc down beside him and left the room without looking back. At the breach in the wall, I lit one of the old chapel candles I'd found earlier and wedged it into the brick. Its glow was small but steady, a pulse against the dark.
I locked the rusted gate behind me.
The official report read like every other tragedy that slips neatly into a file cabinet: structural collapse caused by decades of erosion.
Subsequent fire likely sparked by lightning strike. No casualties.
That was the statement released by the county board 3 days after I left St. Adriel's.
The news cycle repeated it until no one asked for more.
A few locals shrugged about bad foundations and a blessing it wasn't still standing.
No one mentioned the boy. No one mentioned the photographs.
When I drove past the forest weeks later, the trees were blackened, the ground churned to ashen soil. From the road, it looked empty, like it had been scraped clean. But the air still carried that faint, sweet rot lilies drowned in stagnant water.
I knew what they hadn't found. They hadn't found the transfer registry.
They hadn't found the brittle map with its red web. They hadn't found the marble plaques with their chiseled scars.
I'd burned the first 2.
The plaques had always been buried too deep. What they did find was catalogued with bureaucratic neatness: warped bed frames, scorched cots, melted vials.
No mention of the mirrored disc.
No mention of the candle, which should have burned out long before the fire but, according to the lone firefighter who'd been first inside, was still glowing when he reached the breach in the wall. He'd taken it as a keepsake, then reported it missing from the evidence table 2 days later. And there was one other item, listed as miscellaneous debris: a tarnished silver locket, its hinge fused shut from heat. They put it in storage at the County Historical Society, where it sits in a glass case between Civil War buttons and old railroad tokens.
On its back, faint and almost lost to scratches, is the intersecting circle. I went to see it once.
The curator told me it had been recovered from an old parish fire, unaware of the lie she was repeating.
I didn't correct her.
In the months since, the Order of the Fifth Veil has disappeared from my searches.
Websites vanish, archives redirect to unrelated material, scanned documents corrupt overnight. When I checked the diocesan listings, St. Adriel's isn't marked as demolished anymore, it isn't listed at all. But I still hear from them.
At night, just before sleep, there's a tapping inside the walls.
4 strokes, pause. 4 strokes again.
Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see a pale reflection in the darkened window, the curve of a cheek, the tilt of a head. I keep the laudanum vial locked away, wrapped in cloth, though sometimes it's warm to the touch.
I've told myself I'm finished, that I buried it deeper than they ever could.
But when I pass the forest's edge and catch that sickly sweet scent, something in me stirs, not curiosity exactly, not fear either.
More like recognition. I wasn't supposed to find this. And yet, in some quiet chamber beneath the earth, I think they're still waiting. 1.